I'm Judith Lay, welcoming you to the podcast of the Manx Sky at Night with Howard Parkin.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And there it is, the familiar music that tells us it is time to say Faster My and welcome into the studio Howard Parkin for this month's edition of the Manx Sky at Night.
Faster My, Judith, it's great to be here again.
There's a lot to talk about tonight, isn't there?
There always is, even more than usual, I think, though.
And we've got questions and I've been picking up some space news. Let's get started straight away. Is it dark enough?
No, in a word. We don't get beyond what we call astronomical twilight till the 2nd of August, so basically it isn't. It's a beautiful evening this evening. I'm sitting here looking out the window of the studio. Beautiful blue sky, but it needs to be... The sun actually goes down on the 1st of July with 20 to 10 and comes back up again at 10 to 5. That means roughly it's 7 hours of night time, so you need to be looking at the stars about 1 o'clock to get anything decent, to see anything in the sky.
Actually, seriously, I have been looking at this because you've said this a few times in recent programmes, obviously, because this applies for several months.
Of course.
And it doesn't actually really get completely dark, does it?
That's why we term it astronomical twilight. The official definition, it's a bit boring, is astronomical twilight is when the sun is not more than 15 degrees below the horizon. So you look at imagine that the Earth was glass, opaque glass, we could see through it. The sun is just slowly gliding between the western horizon and the eastern horizon, no more than 15 degrees down. And that's a consequence. That happens now as a result of the tilt of the Earth's axis and all the rest. That happens right through now to the 2nd of August. Then, after the 2nd of August, we do get officially into the hours of darkness, when those hours of darkness, of course, extend as the sun goes down a little bit earlier and rises a little bit later.
But it is also the quality of the darkness. You know, you can say sunset and sunrise. But like this morning, I happened to notice that although the sunrise technically was something to 5, 4 o'clock, it was light.
Light. I mean, you've got at least an hour each side of daylight, of sunset, sunrise. So that knocks out, that takes us through to about 11 o'clock at night, and the other way it takes you to about 3 o'clock. So you've got to go right in the middle. So 1 o'clock is the time that I'm talking about, the things we can see in the sky. If people really want to do it, if they're out late or whatever, there are things to see in the sky. Not as much as usual. We've got no planets in the evening sky, but there's always something to look for. And of course, we've got the beautiful object called noctilucent clouds, which are unique to this time of the year because they are clouds that are illuminated by the sun all the time. And as a consequence, they are only visible this time of the year because the sun is not far enough below the horizon. And these beautiful silvery white clouds. I had a report from our secretary of the Astronomical Society, Secretary Graham Gordon, managed to spot some in Edinburgh. Literally a few days ago. I've not had any reports of any being seen from the Isle of Man recently. I'm looking out the window now, and yes, around midnight it may be worth looking for. It's a beautiful clear night out there, but we're not going to see anything of particular darkness until around 1 o'clock. But there's always something to talk about and always something to see.
Well, morning is more of an interesting time, isn't it, at this time of the year?
And normally morning's always a nice time of the year. There's just something about the morning sky, but unfortunately, well, this year in particular, all of the planets have all ganged up together in the morning sky. You've got Mars, Jupiter, Saturn and Venus all appearing in the morning sky at the moment, not visible till about 2-3 o'clock. But that doesn't mean we can't look out for them because that's in the morning sky. But slowly as we go around the sun on our orbit, around the sun on our year or annual journey, that will slowly drift, that we'll eventually get Mars rising before midnight. In about September time, late August, September time, we'll see Mars and Jupiter, followed by Saturn, and then we're going to have the brilliant view of Venus. So plenty to look forward to. But at this stage, take a bit of a breather. Maybe look for some noctilucent clouds before it's too late. But if you are up late and you are around at 1 o'clock in the morning, look to the south and see if you can see the brilliantly red object in the sky. That's not Mars. That is the star Antares, the principal star in the constellation of Scorpio. And that is a very red star. And the very name Antares is Latin for rival of Mars. Ant, rival of Mars. Ares, which is the god of war. And Antares and Mars, really, when you see them close together, which we saw a few years ago, they were close together, you can understand how they get mixed up. Mars does get a lot brighter than Antares does, but it is quite distinctively noticeable. So if you are up around 1 o'clock in the morning, look due south and see if you can see a red coloured star low on the southern horizon. You're looking at the principal star of the constellation of Scorpio.
And we can be all smart and say to somebody who happens to be around at the time, I bet you think that's Mars, but it isn't.
Exactly. You see, you've been listening to Manx Radio. The other great feature I want to just talk about briefly is the M45 cluster, which is in the constellation of Taurus the Bull. Now, this cluster is famous for a whole host of reasons. It's the beginning of the start of the winter stars rising. And when you see this cluster rising for the first time, these are the 7 sisters who were weeping because one of their sisters died. The 8th sister died. They're weeping. It's what we call the watery part of the sky. And the arrival of the M45 cluster in Taurus the Bull, or the Pleiades as it's well known, is quite significant. More so to the Maoris of New Zealand. I learned this when I was down there earlier this year. They actually celebrate the rising of the stars of the Pleiades, M45 as I call it. They call this Matariki. And look it up on the internet if you don't believe me. Matariki is the name given by the Maori to the group of stars that rise in their midwinter. It's the start of the midwinter period and all the rest. Like we have New Year's Day, they have their own seasons, of course, the reverse to us. And in 2002, I think it was, the New Zealand government acknowledged the importance of this particular feature rising in the sky at this particular time of the year. And now, if you're in New Zealand on the 29th of June, just gone last Friday, it's a bank holiday, Matariki Day. I knew nothing of this story until I went to New Zealand, so I took it upon myself to spread the word around the world, the Matariki Day, when you see the stars of the Pleiades rising for the first time in the sky, which of course rise in our sky just like they rise in the New Zealand sky, but of course they're in the middle of our summer, it's the middle of their winter.
But these things are so important that these customs, traditions,
Absolutely.
legends need to be enshrined. Otherwise, they can just be
They
swept
get lost.
away. Yeah.
I mean, I love talking, as we've done it before loads of times, I love talking about the mythology of the constellations and the stories. And usually there's a tiny, tiny grain of truth in them. We've talked about Algol, the demon star. We've talked about Coma Berenices. And all these mythological stories have something to do with the observational characteristics that the ancient observers would have seen. And it's great to see it carried on. And it's great to see the New Zealand government felt sufficiently moved by this story about Matariki, or the Pleiades as we call it, to denote it with a bank holiday. So I think we should have another bank holiday in the Isle of Man to celebrate the same. What do you think, Judith?
I think that with your expert knowledge, we could create a whole range of bank holidays celebrating various phenomena in the sky.
Absolutely
Make
right.
a few notes.
I will make a few notes and I'll come back to you with some dates.
Could you do something a little more romantic than the M45 cluster? Because I thought you were talking about a motorway.
Isn't it safe for Birmingham?
The Matariki is a much more
better name. Much better name.
But you know,
indeed.
I'm not going to take up valuable time by covering ground that we already have done, but I think it's wonderful that so long ago, when the people who looked into the sky had no instrumentation or anything to
that's
help them,
fascinating.
that still they knew that there was something bigger than them going on. And yes, they made up stories and legends, but at least they were trying to get to
and they
grips
passed them
with
on generation to generation, and even today and now. That's why I say it's so important that they've done that. I mean, there are lots of stories I can give you and legends, but it was just nice to see this one acknowledged publicly by a country.
Right. Again, I don't want to cover ground that we've covered quite exhaustively, but any chances of aurora, more aurora?
Absolutely. I've made a note to
Really?
say that because the aurora on the 10th of May was outstanding. One of the best displays for about 50 years. It really was outstanding, and I missed it. I was on the ship and we didn't see it at all. I knew it was coming, but we didn't see it. But it was seen as far south as Florida and Malta. And Madeira, sorry, not Malta, Madeira. It really was a spectacular eruption of material from the sun, which I'm sorry, I'm going to be boring now, listeners. A coronal mass ejection on the sun. The material, the plasma, left the sun and impacted the upper Earth's atmosphere 3 days later on May the 10th and gave us this wonderful display of aurora. That's the technical reason for what happened to give us this beautiful display. Well, the sun is going through a cycle, an 11-year cycle. I've mentioned this before. And the 11-year cycle peaks in 2024. This means there's every chance of another coronal mass ejection on the sun. Basically, sunspots. We all know what sunspots are. Please don't look at the sun with the naked eye, whatever you do. I always have to say that. But there's every chance of another massive coronal mass ejection, material being erupted from the solar surface causing aurora. It wasn't a particularly good time of the year, 10th of May, to see the aurora. It's still too light in May. May, June, July are not good months for stargazing. But I was fascinated and amazed how many people in the Isle of Man got out to see them, and there's been some magnificent photographs. And I'm delighted to say on air, Judith, that the Post Office, the Isle of Man Post Office, as a consequence of this auroral display on the 10th of May, are looking at, and indeed are going ahead with the issue of a set of stamps next year to show the aurora as seen from the Isle of Man.
Brilliant.
And I've had some photographs sent to me, some magnificent photographs. And thank you anyone who sent any to me. And I've seen them on Facebook and all sorts of places. But I can't stress enough how marvellous that display was. And there's every chance between now and roughly, I'm saying, probably next March, there's every chance we'll have another display.
Really?
Maybe of similar stature. They reckon this one was one of the top 20 in the last 500 years and the best one for 25 years. And I've seen pictures, there's marvellous pictures. I'm just mentioning one by name, a chap called Andrew, I've forgotten his surname now, took some wonderful pictures at Groudle Head of the aurora with the MER tram tracks, overhead lines in the foreground. And what the Post Office have asked me to do is to get images which show something Manx in the foreground. So you can imagine I've got pictures of Peel Castle, I've got the lighthouse at the top of the Isle of Man, you've got Bradder Head. But this one in particular, this one Andrew took, Andrew Reeves I think his name is, taken from Groudle. And you know, he took it with an iPhone. That is what is incredible. So yes, I know we covered the aurora, the actual display we covered last month. But yes, keep your eyes and ears peeled. We are tending now to get a little bit of warning because we understand when there's activity on the sun, we can see these groups of sunspots. But just to put it in perspective, these sunspots that gave this display on May the 10th, those sunspots are something like 5 or 6 times the size of the whole Earth. That's the eruption of this material is erupting from the solar surface from a storm that is 5 or 6 times the diameter of the Earth. It makes you feel humble.
It really does.
But it also makes you marvel at what we see, the natural beauty of what we see, these colours. And this time round, we saw the colours. The colours were visible, not just the green glow, which we see in the camera. There was lots of colours visible as well.
Yeah. And the interesting thing was that because so many people were able to catch photographs of them because, you know, we generally have our phones handy. But all the photographs were just slightly different.
Yes, that's the whole
Some people
point.
had more or less of a certain colour in, and that's what made them all so very special.
Really was special.
It was.
And every real chance that we'll get another display, hopefully sometime in the next 6 months.
So keep looking upwards.
Keep looking upwards.
Right. Now, on that note, let's have some music that's going to herald our look out into space.
Bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, blue moon, blue moon, dip, 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 moon, 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 blue moon, dip, 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 moon, moon, blue moon, dip, 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 bomb, 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 dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, blue moon. You saw me standing alone without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. Dang, 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 ding, dong, ding, blue moon. You knew just what I was there for. You heard me saying a prayer for someone I really care for. And then suddenly, oh dear, the only one my arms will ever hold. I heard somebody whisper, please, oh, don't dang dang dang, ding it on ding blue. Dang dang dang, ding it on ding blue.
I have to tell you that Howard Parkin was singing away to that one, the Marcells and Blue Moon. He did also say to me that we should save it until there is a blue moon. But we'll move on from that. You are listening to this month's edition of the Manx Sky at Night. In the studio with me is Howard Parkin. Howard, we are now in the world of space, and we've got a question from Graham in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And he's asking us about something that I think you were planning to talk about. Anyway, Graham's actual question is, I understand NASA has chosen SpaceX to bring down the ISS as it nears the end of its life. Can Howard tell us more about it and the process involved?
Right, good question. Thank you for asking that. And yes, I was going to cover that one because this contract was only issued by NASA a few days ago, literally. The situation is the International Space Station is getting old. It's been up there since 1999. It's been occupied since the year 2000. And it is estimated it's got a realistic shelf life till around 2030. The European Space Agency, the Canadians and even the Russians have agreed to keep it going until beyond 2028 and into 2030. But eventually it needs to be vacated, and then it would just deorbit itself. But what I say about that is slowly but surely the orbit would degrade due to the gravitational pull of the Earth, and the space station would come in uncontrolled. So what they're going to do, they're going to be responsible, because this is it's roughly the size of the interior of a jumbo jet. That's the living area. Then you've got all the solar panels and all the other bits and pieces on the side. So there's a lot of material up there. So basically what they're going to do, they've tasked SpaceX with building a propulsion unit. They're going to go up with this rocket, and they're going to fire the rocket to make it slow down to a certain position where it will re-enter at a controlled pace or controlled place. And the intention is to bring it down in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I understand. They did this with the Skylab, but that was not as controlled. So this time the responsible thing to do is to go up with a proper device, attach it to it, fire this rocket, basically slow it down, because the space station is going around the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour. If you slow it down, what astronauts do when they fire their retro rockets, they slow themselves down and basically fall to Earth. But you don't just fall, you re-enter, and the friction of the Earth's atmosphere will burn an awful lot of material up. So that's what they're going to do with the space station, but they're going to do it in such a way that no major debris will fall on populated areas.
But will it all just be debris when it eventually comes down? Will there be anything salvageable?
There'll be nothing salvageable. There will be some pieces which will probably make it to the ocean, but there'll be nothing of consequence that will be worth recovering. They will have stripped it out of all the stuff they need to keep. Obviously, the living accommodation will be emptied out. There'll be film safes and things like that will be brought back, I'm guessing. But the bulk of it will just re-enter and burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. It's a responsible thing to do, and SpaceX have been given the contract. $843 million this contract is worth, and that is not including the launch of this particular propulsion unit. But SpaceX obviously have got a great pedigree now of doing stuff, and they're giving them this contract now, 5-6 years beforehand, to develop it and get it ready, and then NASA will take over the actual running of the propulsive unit, and the space station will be no more. But before then, companies like Axiom are going to build a space station alongside and attached to the ISS, and they're going to detach their space station from the ISS, and there'll be a private space station up there by 2030, if not before.
But this is what you have been saying for a long time, that private enterprise coming into this is going to change
the whole thing
face
is changing dramatically. There's been a number of commercial launches already, and there's so many more on the horizon. And that's why we've got SpaceX, which leads us lovely into the next story about Boeing, because the Boeing story, bit of a disaster really for Boeing, because way back in 2014, NASA realised they couldn't concentrate on getting up to the International Space Station and develop a new rocket to take them back to the moon. So they awarded 2 contracts, one to SpaceX to provide the Dragon spacecraft, which would go up and down to the International Space Station, and one to Boeing. Well, SpaceX launched in 2020. Eventually, after 6 years, they got their spacecraft up and going, and they've been ferrying passengers up and down to the space station since 2020. Boeing's spacecraft has had a checkered history and all sorts of problems. And indeed, they finally launched the Boeing spacecraft to the International Space Station a few weeks ago now, end of May. They launched this spacecraft to the International Space Station on its final test flight, which has got a man and a woman on board. And unfortunately, on the way up to the space station, there was a problem with the thrusters, which give it the manoeuvrability to get to the right place. They managed to dock with the International Space Station, but now, because they've got this problem, they don't want to bring the spacecraft back until they know what's caused the problem, and they want to make sure the 2 astronauts on board the space station currently can come back safely in it. And they only announced a couple of days ago that the mission had been extended from days to weeks, and then up to 45 days, and they're now saying they may leave the actual spacecraft and the astronauts up there for up to 90 days, 3 months, before they'll bring it back. They're not concerned about the safety of the astronauts, but they're concerned about the spacecraft performing properly. It's a real blow for Boeing, because I suspect what's going to happen is when they do finally bring it back, this is going to cause a further delay, and the operation of the Boeing spacecraft up and down to the International Space Station is probably going to be delayed another year at least. And there's SpaceX going ahead with it all the time, and the Dragon spacecraft. And thankfully that's the case, because otherwise the Americans would be depending on the Russians to send NASA astronauts up into space. And I can't remember the figure now, but the charge per seat, I think it was $2 million a seat, something like that. So NASA are delighted they've got Dragon, but they would like to have Boeing Starliner as well. So it's all going on at the moment, Judith, I tell you. The other great story, though, is the SpaceX launched their Starship at the beginning of June. That was I won't say it was 100% success, but this is the massive rocket they launched, which they brought back down. They knew they weren't going to bring it back down properly. They crashed the first stage into the sea, into the Indian Ocean, and the second stage, the Starship itself, went into the Gulf of Mexico. But now they are toying, and this, you'll think I'm making this up, Judith, but the first stage of the Super Heavy is actually going to come back down to Earth and land on the launch pad it took off at, and it's going to be caught. If you imagine by a pair of chopsticks, big, massive industrial-sized chopsticks, the rocket's going to come down and be caught by these big, massive booms that are sticking out, and then when they've caught it, they'll then lower it to the surface.
Howard, I believe everything you say. You've got an honest face. I believe it. No, but I mean, that's got to be saving things. Has
of course
got
it is.
To be
that
the way.
Huge rocket goes up full of fuel, goes up, does its job, then comes back down. They landed. When they first started doing this, landing these rocket stages on a barge in the Atlantic Ocean, and they fell over, everyone laughed. Everyone thought, what a waste of money, what a stupid thing to try and do. They've now done it over 100 times. There are rockets that have flown about, I think one particular Falcon's first stage has flown 7 times.
Yeah.
And there's some wonderful videos of the Falcon Heavy, which is 3 Falcon 9 rockets strapped together, bringing back the 2 stages, the 2 strap-on boosters, back down to Earth side by side and landing them at Cape Kennedy. And there's videos of that on the internet. Incredible. And this is private enterprise.
And this really is the way forward.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, but I've just got to read out a message from Andy. And I think to an extent you've just answered this one, because Andy says, will removing the ISS be like the Lord Street bus station, taken away before a replacement is in its place? But I think you did hint.
I mean, NASA have also got a space station plan to go around the moon, the Gateway. They're going to put a space station around the moon. That's going to be how they go back to and from the moon. There are all sorts of plans which are being built. And I can say this firsthand because I went over to NASA in Houston, as I said, last month, and saw some of the facilities there that they're building at the moment. And it is just incredible what's going on. And we don't realise it here in the island, but there's so much going on. And I say to youngsters when I go into schools, you know, there's every possibility that people on the Isle of Man here today will end up in space, because there's such a huge amount of industry and a huge amount of things going on up there.
Good question, Andy, and I can understand where it's coming from, but because it's private enterprise, they'll be making sure that the whole thing flows along.
Exactly.
And we have been, talking of flowing along, we've been beaten by the clock, Howard.
Once again.
We're out of time, and I am delighted to say that Howard Parkin will be back in the studio on the last Sunday in the month of July, taking another look at the Manx sky at night and everything in space. Howard Parkin, Fast Am I. Thank you.
Fast Am I, Judith.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.